Welcome back. Today we're talking about creating space and creating space within your drawings. Space is one of the 7 elements of art, and there are a lot of different ways to achieve space, but we're going to talk about 6 different ones. Notice I created 6 different boxes. You should do the same and practice this along with me. Now I labeled all my different boxes so I know exactly what each one of them is if I need to go back and reference this. First box I'm going to look at is overlapping. Now overlapping, I'm just going to use a basic circle with all my boxes or a sphere. Remember, because in a previous episode we talked about shading. And when you overlap, you have lines, right? But obviously I want one of my shapes in front of the other. So I can draw them out and erase like so. Or if I wanted to, I could have just done that and implied that line being behind it. Now the last thing I want to do is establish a picture plane or a horizon line right in the background, and then I have overlapping. In the next box over here, we have shading. So starting off again with a circle, and this time around we are going to create a sphere. Now, if you've done this before, this should be practice and relatively easy. On a sphere, you have a light source coming in and a highlighted area. You're going to have a core shadow that's darker. A lot of times you'll have reflected light on the back and a cast shadow. Cast shadow is the shadow that's on the table or on the ground, like so. And as you work, you can add different values, and the amount of pressure that you're using is going to vary. So if you have a lighter area, you're not using as much pressure. And of course, in a darker area, you would use more. If you have a blending stump, you can definitely grab it and utilize your blending stump. But when you're working with spheres, you always want to have a nice clean edge all the way around. And the more you work and improve, the happier you will be with your end result. But very, very basic sphere. I'm just going to rework this a little bit more and move on. All right. The next one I'm going to look at is going to be placement. Where you place your objects, if they are all the same size, on your paper, where you place them is going to make a difference in what looks closer and what looks further away. And my circles may not be 100% the same, but they're relatively close, and this is just practice. We got our picture plane, our horizon line. Now, the ones that are higher up on the page are generally going to look like they are farther away. And that's the case whenever you're working with things. A lot of times, things that are closer to you are also going to be more in focus, which we'll look at here in a second. Just going to add in a little bit of values on each of these. My light source closer to the very, very top on this one. I might go back and add a little bit more. Finish those off, make them look really nice here after a minute. But let's move on. On this one, we're looking at size. Now the size of your objects, if they are closer to you, they are going to be larger. And sometimes they might go in a line, but not always. And again, having some shading never hurt anybody. So I'll go in and add more values and shading, make these look like nice little spheres. But for our purposes right this second, I'm just gonna block in where my light source would be and my cast shadow. So I know where my light source is based on where my highlight is and my cast shadow. Remember, the cast shadow is what is on the table. Okay, our next one over here is going to be value and focus. So on value and focus, we have, of course, our first circle. Maybe there's one behind it. Notice that I'm using overlapping in this one too. You can combine your ways to create space. That's a wonderful way, and we're getting them smaller, just like on size. It's a wonderful way to achieve space, and the more you utilize, the more you showcase, the better you get, and the happier you will be with your end result. Now with value and focus, your first sphere is going to be very detailed, and obviously when you're working with a different object or a different drawing, you probably won't have spheres for your objects, and that's perfectly fine, but for our purposes I am using a sphere. Now your first object or sphere is going to be very, very well done, extremely well finished details, and your values are going to be more pronounced, so it's going to be a little bit darker than the rest of them. As they move back, as you move to your other spheres, it's going to be lighter, okay? So it's going to be lighter, and you're not going to have as well defined of objects. That's very important to recognize as you're working, and keep that in mind moving forward, okay? Once you get your sphere to a point where you're very happy with it, you'd move on to the next one. Now the one behind it, I gotta fix this because that's not 100% accurate. The one behind it would be a little bit lighter. You're still gonna have some dark spots within it, but to differentiate between the two, it's gonna be lighter. Your highlighted areas are going to be lighter. And the whole thing in general is gonna be lighter because as it moves back on the page, your details fade, and so do your values. So notice that my base that I'm starting out with is a little bit lighter already. Everything in. Barely any pressure right now. Okay, you're still gonna have that core shadow. A little bit darker than it was on the last one. And you'll have your cast shadow. Not darker than it was on the last one, lighter, excuse me. Moving back again. Super light on top. My edges, since it's a three-dimensional object, as it curves around, it's darker on the sides, so I gotta make sure to plot that in. And they're gonna curve around. And I'll use a blending stump. I'll go in and use a blending stump to soften out these lines here after a little bit. But again, lighter than this one, a little lighter than this one, but not everywhere because they're still relatively similar. And if you think you might have gotten too light on this one or not gotten dark enough, you can always go back and add in. And on the very back one, very light on your highlighted spots. You just kind of tap in your values. And that is value and focus. The last one I want to look at is linear perspective. Linear perspective, when you're working with perspective, you always have a horizon line, and in our case, we're doing a vanishing point, just 1 point perspective, and it's going to grow. Oh. A lot of times when you're working with perspective, you want to use a ruler, but since we're just practicing, I'm not. But I still want to do well. So adjust. And when you're working with linear perspective, everything is very, very accurate and grows. So it's similar to size, except for more precise. It grows in a specific fashion. And again, when you shade, we're going to incorporate value and focus. So the one closer is going to be in better detail than the ones further away. I got a little large there. Again, just practicing, do your best. And of course, you'd have your cast shadows on this side. Not as precise going back, so relatively light. Medium, toned, and the front one would be very dark and much more detailed. And that is 6 different ways of creating space. Now you can tell that it didn't fully finish some of these, so let's look at how it could look like at the end. Thanks for watching.